Hello again, YouTube. So, I made a crystal radio, and I thought you might want to know how to build it too. So, this is a really simple design. Just consists of a variable capacitor, which you can easily make from some cardboard tubes and aluminum foil. It's very adjustable this way. And I have the little sweeper here, which is just a cardboard tube with wire around it, and I sanded off some of the enamel coating on one side, so this little sweeper arm can tune into different frequencies. And I also have the diode right here. It's a diode from this package, it's the 1N34 diode. So I thought you might want to learn how to make one, except I'm going to make an extra tiny one. So I already wound the coil like this. Basically I just have 25 turns on this small coil, and then I have 90 turns on this bigger coil, and they're about maybe 1/8 of an inch apart. I coated this spot right here with super glue, and then I took my box cutter and scraped away the super glue and the enamel so I can keep it all together while I have a little tiny sweeper arm on it. And then I have some different variable capacitors right here. Some bigger ones, some smaller ones. So now we need to test the capacitors. We have 4 capacitors. This one, this one, this one, and this one. So now I will take some alligator clips and just attach them to the capacitors like that and like this. There, now I take these two and connect them to where this capacitor used to go. And I have already detached this capacitor, so yeah, I'll just stick these on and see how well it works. Okay, so this capacitor actually works really well. Okay, so we also have this one. Now this one is really weird. You can see right here, it's like there's 2 like separate things on each side and then the one in the center. So it's really weird that way. So we'll see how this one works. It'll probably be pretty interesting. Okay, so this one doesn't really work at all. I don't know why. It is pretty weird. Then we have this one. Now this one is a little bit different. Instead of one kind of like this, well, instead of this one where you have all these little plates and they just like go in and out, so instead of 2 plates going in and out like that, they're getting closer or farther apart, which is like this one. So this is kind of interesting. It's basically a screw and the plates, so this one is kind of interesting. Okay, so this was kind of interesting. It actually works really well. And it's nice and small and pretty easy to turn. So I'll see if I can use this one. I think I can because it just works really well. See right here, it's just the little screw right here, a washer, and the 2 plates and some plastic. That's all this capacitor really is. So yeah, I think I'm going to use this one. We have one more to test, which is this one, so we'll see how well this one works. Okay, so this one works not that well though, so I think it works better than this really weird one, but not as well as I was hoping it would. So these 2 work really well. This one works the best, except it is a little bit big for what I want, and there's not much to mount it on. This one is going to be really, really easy to use, and it has a knob already on it and everything. So I'm going to use this capacitor for this crystal radio that I'm making. It's probably going to go inside somewhere, maybe off to the side. So we have the capacitor, the diode, and the coil here. And the coil, I recorded myself making it, but the camera didn't actually like work. There was something wrong with it. Just wasn't recording for some reason. So I reset the camera and it starts recording again. Yeah, here's the coil. I basically just put a piece of tape over it, so I can show it. I can kind of show you making it. So you would take a piece of tape, you would put it over here on the end like this. So just one more piece on top of that is good enough. Then after that, you want to open this up and you want to get your wire out. Now this is 20 gauge wire, so usually you would probably use something like 26 gauge, except I don't have any of that. Make it right now. So you put the two pieces of tape on it like this, one underneath and one on top. The piece of tape underneath is to keep it from pulling up the cardboard and tearing it up. And then what you want to do is put the wire down in here. It's maybe a foot of extra wire coming out of the end. And then you want to set it under the tape, just like that, a little bit from the edge, and probably can't see this wire, as straight as possible while turning it. I did 25 turns for the little coil, like this one, and 90 turns for the bigger one. And then let's just say I now have 25 turns on this, even though it's only 2. I pull this tape open, and then I set the wire close back as I possibly can, as close to the rest of the coil as I possibly can, and then fold the tape down. And that's basically how you would end the coil. And well, then you would cut the wire, and then you pretty much do the same thing on the next coil, except leave a little bit of a gap in between. This is about 1/8 of an inch, and you should be good. Make sure that you turn the coils the same direction. So if you're winding this one and you turning it clockwise, you want to turn it clockwise in the next coil you make, or you might have a problem and it won't work. You can't forget the piezoelectric earpiece. So this is basically a little piezo speaker. Well, you can get them pretty much in any little cheap toy that makes noise. They look like a little golden disc, but you can get them probably on eBay or Amazon for pretty cheap, and they're extremely sensitive. You can actually take the 2 wires on the end and touch them together, and you can hear noise in the earpiece, which is really sensitive. So I'm just going to desolder my earpiece from my bigger crystal radio so I can borrow it for my tiny crystal radio. There we go. Now I have the earpiece by itself, just the wires and just this part. Now we need to connect it to everything else. So we need the capacitor, the diode, the coil, and the earpiece to start it off. Okay, so this is the schematic. You can see that we have the coil, the capacitor, the diode, and the antenna. Okay, so first thing is we have all these wires coming out of the coils now. We want to take the wire from the big coil on the far side and connect it to the smaller coil on the inside. So we have a little tiny solder connection over here. Basically, to actually solder to these, you would take the wire like this, and I like to take some kind of lighter or something. I like to just burn the enamel coating off of it. After that, I take something like some kind of knife, like my box cutter, and scrape all the burnt stuff off. This works really well. You could just skip the part where you burn the enamel coating off, but I like to do both because it just kind of works a little bit better that way. And you want to be careful while doing this and not push too hard, or you might cut the wire itself. So be careful while doing that. Be especially careful when you're using extremely thin wire, because that's even harder to do. Then after that, you want to dip the tip of it. After that, you want to dip the tip of the wire into some flux and then solder to it. So I just have some huge blob of solder right here. So there we go. Our wire is tinned. Now, this is just a spool of wire. I already did all of that on these. So again, you want to connect the outside wire from the big coil to the inside wire of the smaller coil, like this. And I twisted them together, dipped them in flux, and then I soldered them together. So now I have a good joint. Then I have these 2 extra wires coming out of the end. So you want to take the inside wire of the really big coil and connect that to the back end of the diode. Now you see on the diode right here how there's a black stripe on one side, and you want to connect the the inside of the big coil to the wire without the stripe. You can twist it, except I like to solder it because it just works better that way. After that, you want to get your capacitor, like this one, and you want to solder a wire from one end of the capacitor to the spot where these two wires meet up. The outside wire from the big coil, inside wire from the small coil. Okay, so now I've tinned the ends of this wire, and I'm going to solder it to this variable capacitor right here. I soldered the wire to the end of the capacitor now. It doesn't matter which end because they're just two plates of metal next to each other. Now, I take this end of the capacitor. You want to connect this wire to the back end of the diode. This wire from the capacitor to the end of the diode without the stripe. Now, you want to take the other end of the capacitor and you want to attach it to ground, which are these two wires. Now comes the earpiece. So we have the two wires from the earpiece, and now we take these two wires, I've already tinned them, and one of the wires, it doesn't matter which one, goes to the end of the diode with the stripe on it. So now we have one of the wires on the striped side of the diode. Then the last wire will connect to ground, which is this end of the capacitor. Now we should have one extra wire coming out of the 25 turn coil, the smaller coil. We have this one extra wire, that's where the antenna goes, and then ground connects to where the coil wires go to, and the earpiece goes to. Okay, so I forgot one thing. We need the sweeper arm. So I have this little piece of metal here, and we want to solder it to a wire. Then on the other end of the wire, that also connects to ground. Connect this to ground too. There we go. Now we just need to test it. So we have the little sweeper arm right here. That's going to go across these to tune it. We have the antenna connection. We have our ground connection on this end of the capacitor. And we have the earpiece. So I'm going to go test this and see if it works. Now we have it mostly set up here. The first thing we want to do is connect it to ground. So right here I have this cable that plugs into the wall. It's usually used for something like computer power supplies, maybe chargers for your laptop or something. And then I have this, which it plugs into, and I got it from a computer power supply. What you want to do is you want to connect a wire to the center lug. And I put tape over these two other ones because I don't really want to electrocute myself. So we want to plug this in like that while doing stuff like this because you can shock yourself pretty badly. Then you want to take an alligator clip, connect it to here, to the center one, and I'm going to connect that to the ground connection, which is by the capacitor. So now I have the ground connection, and now I need the antenna. So the antenna is basically a extension cord like this one, and I have a whole bunch of them. I have probably about 60 feet of extension cords all stuck to each other, laid out on the floor. And you want to, when you make this, you want to make sure that the antenna is very well laid out and there's space in between it all. So you don't want the antenna to be all coiled up in one big ball because that won't work very well. And then I have all the little connections on the extension cord all connected together, and they all go to this one. That extra little wire right here, you probably can't see it, but this is the antenna connection. Now it's time for testing. So to do that, we have the capacitor that we can adjust, and then we also have this little sweeper thing that can go across to different spots of the coil. And the first second I put the earpiece in my ear, I can hear radio. This crystal radio is actually working really well right now. Now let's see if you can hear this. Okay, so I'm going to put the earpiece up to the microphone so you can hear it. I think I'm going to finish building this, and I'll probably leave a little bit of extra room after this coil to put maybe something like a 9-volt battery and an amplifier in there, so I can use a much smaller antenna. I have now cut the end off. I also used some of these extremely tiny tungsten carbide drill bits to drill holes right next to all of the wires. So now I can pull the wires inside and out of the way, and I'm also going to put everything else inside too. They left a lot of extra room, so I can put an amplifier circuit in there and maybe some batteries if I need to actually power this circuit. And maybe I'll have enough room to add an antenna or something too. I'm warming up my soldering iron right now. See right there, warming up. So now what's left to do would be to figure out some kind of sweeper arm thing that can go across. So I have these really nice rods. These rods came out of DVD players, and I was thinking if I take one of these, cut it in half, so then I'll have two of them like that. I would have two of them right next to each other, and then I'll have the sweeper arm in between that can go across back and forth. And then hopefully this will work really well, and I'll have a nice little tiny AM radio. I think I can get away with using two of these next to each other and taking a paper clip and bending that, but not a little cheap paper clip. Get one of the old style ones. They're much higher quality steel, and they don't break as easily too. I cut the rod in half, and now I have two rods. These are going to go about here on top of the coil, and then I'm going to bend this paper clip up to make a nice little sweeper thing that goes across. And I also got some copper wire. I think this is 10 gauge copper wire, because these have to come off with some kind of distance. So I need to drill holes going through the other side. Probably 4 holes for 4 little pieces of copper wire to hold these up in the air. So I have my 2 little rods and my 4 copper wires, and I just tested to see if solder would take to the rods, because I have this other one, and solder only takes to it when I sand it. So I'm going to have to be careful and just sand the ends of these so solder doesn't stick to the rest of it. Okay, I drilled the holes now, so the copper wires almost fit. That's good because I want them to be snug so they don't slip around. Then after that, I will solder the little rods to the copper wires. I put the wires in and I hot glued them in place. So now what's left is to put these on. So I would probably solder them somehow, and before that I have to make the actual thing that slides with this paper clip. I started to make this little coil around one end of the paper clip so it can slide in and out. And if you notice that if you pull up or down on it, it'll just get stuck. Like just the weight of this will keep it from going down. So to stop that, what you would want to do would be to make this tighter to have as small play as possible, and also to make this thing longer. So now I have these 2 loops kind of made so it can slide now. It's a little bit stiff because I did not have enough paper clip to do this one all the way. So this one moves really freely, and this one does not. So I think that's okay. I mean, if I just oil one of them. And I also have this. This is a little piece of metal. I'm going to be soldering it to this as a little spring to touch these wires. So I soldered on the little piece of metal and bent it to shape now. Maybe you can see if the camera will focus. Probably won't focus. I think it's a fixed focus lens anyway. You can see that we have a little shape here, just like a little springy shape, so it solders on the bottom, goes out and back around, and then there's a little bent piece on this end that will hopefully brush against this really nicely as it goes back and forth. So now it's kind of springy, so it'll always give a reasonable amount of pressure, because that's pretty much about a perfect amount of pressure right there. And then it'll just slide back and forth. So all that's next would be to really just solder these on. Okay, so I just soldered these on. They actually worked, and it moves up and down now. Not as smooth as I was hoping, but I think if I maybe oil it or grease it, it should work better after that. I also put a little paper clip on top, a little piece of paper clip as a brace to make it a little bit stronger. And yeah, there we go. It works. Works quite nicely too. So now we have this part that moves, and I also hot glued these popsicle sticks to the back of the capacitor and rounded the edges so it'll fit something like that on top. Put a better connection right there, jumping both copper wires. So now I need to take these 2 wires coming from the outside of the big coil and the inside of the small coil, and I'm going to just twist the ends together. Now I need to solder them to this thing in the center. Okay, I now have these 2 wires on the ground, and now we have these 2 other wires. Where do they go? Well, this one right here connects to the outside of the smaller coil, so that's the antenna. We can ignore that for now. And the wire from the inside of the larger coil goes to the end of a diode and the end of a capacitor. So here's our capacitor, and here's some wire. So we need to connect this wire to one end of the capacitor. Okay, I finally got this wire soldered on. Took a while to heat up this capacitor. And now this wire needs to go to the negative lead. So I'll leave myself a little bit of extra wire. Okay, now this wire needs to connect to the negative. The negative are these two things in the middle. Now on the other end of the capacitor, we need the inside of the bigger coil. So this is the wire for the inside of the bigger coil. Now this will connect to the capacitor right here. Okay, now for the diode. So here's the diode from my last crystal radio. And this needs to connect to the end of the capacitor that is not on ground. Now we want this side without the stripe. You can see right here, one side has a black stripe on it. We're going to use the side without the stripe. So the side without the stripe is going to go on the end of the capacitor that is not connected to ground. Okay, so I found this circuit board, and it has something I want on it. It has this little thing right here. And this is what you'll use to plug something in like your headphones. Now you can't use normal headphones with a crystal radio because a crystal radio is higher voltage and normal headphones are lower voltage. So they don't match very well. But I'm going to be using this anyway because I want some kind of way to connect something to my radio without a little piezoelectric crystal permanently stuck there. So I'm having trouble desoldering it, and I have my blowtorch here, so I think I'm just going to use that. Okay, so now I've got the headphone part taken off. There's this connector here that's proprietary and we don't need that, so I'm just going to cut that off. So I desoldered this and chopped it off, and what I did was I connected these two wires together into one wire, and then I have this one on the end. This one on the end will be negative and this one will be positive. So this will connect to the striped end of the diode, and the last one will be connected directly to ground. This is a typical headphone jack. The tip of it, positive, and then the smaller stripe underneath it is also positive. And the bottom piece, the biggest one, is negative. So basically, with these two wires being connected, that's connecting the positives together, and then we have the negative by itself. So now I'm going to solder this on. This extra wire goes to the diode, and then the very last one goes to ground. Okay, now I have this connected, and I'm just going to kind of shove it in here. Now we're also keeping this extra wire out, because that's where the antenna goes. And here's the radio finished. You can see right here we have the variable capacitor. Because this part was this end of the capacitor was connected to the antenna, then whenever I touched it, it wouldn't work, so I put some shrink tubing over it, and that's why it looks black. We have our kind of sweeper thing here, made out of the paper clip and the spring, touching the coil. We have these two wires coming out right here. You have a positive and negative. This is the antenna, and this is the ground connection. And then we also have the earpiece right here. It's a little piezoelectric earpiece, and I put a little, I think it's a 3.5mm headphone jack on it, and this fits in the jack on top. And then I still have all the rest of this space inside to put some amplifying circuit inside. That might be a future video. Or if you want to learn more on crystal radios, you can go to the channel rimstarOrg. There's a lot more about crystal radios there, including how they work and even how to make one that doesn't require a ground connection. And that's pretty much it for this video. I'll see you next time. So something really weird I found was you can take a guitar amplifier like this one and one of the diodes, and you can hold on to the negative lead of the cable and the cathode of the diode and touch the tip of the diode, the tip of the connector. So you can actually hear the radio with just the diode and an amplifier.